Welcome to round one of Korea Worlds 2021. It's very, very exciting to finally be here. I'm your chair. My name's Bobby. I'm a former debater from the States. Do my panelists want to introduce themselves? Round one of Korea Worlds 2021.
My name is Mitri. I'm also very glad to see all of you
here.
in this round.
I'm your chair. My name's Bobby. I'm
hello, I'm Karen. Good luck in this round.
Do my panelists want to introduce themselves? Round one of Korea Worlds 2021. Great. So as a reminder, this round is being recorded.
Hello.
Speeches will be 7 minutes with 1 minute of protected time on either end. In the 5 minutes in between, points of information can and should be offered, but and in the protected time, they should not be. Are there any questions, or are we ready to kick it off? Great. And then without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to open the case that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
I am audible. I assume I'm audible. Just give me a second. I think it's important to ward off Chinese influence on North Korea's dependence on China and create economic interdependence to make sure that South Korean interest is upheld. So first of all, I'm going to do some setup. So what is the interest of South Korea? I think it's in economic and political stability generally in the region to make sure there isn't an alleviation of militaristic conflict. I think thirdly is also to elevate Chinese influence in the region. I think South Korea generally has an interest in making better relationships with North Korea. For instance, the Moonshine policy, President Moon has recently had policy of better negotiations with North Korea. The anti-leaflet law also existed, which led to, it's just an example of further continuation of efforts. So I think the government, what the government has to defend on is continuation of these efforts in economics, in an economic field. And going on through this path. So what does a significant increase looks like? I think it looks like increase in trade in exports and imports. South Korea is a major economy. It has semiconductors and many things. I think it can globalize the economy. I think it can offer a lot of things to North Korea. Secondly, reduction of tariffs and quotas and embargoes are gone. I think more offering the regime there to infrastructure and foreign investment development. I think fourthly, I think aiming to increase this also looks like, first of all, I think having negotiations with North Korea, which is a very important part of the debate. So how do these negotiations with this aim of increasing economic cooperation will look like, and why are they likely? So first of all, what they will look like. I think compromising on nuclear programs while also helping North Korea financially is something that's likely going to happen. I think initially, I think the trade is going to be no strings attached. We are going to help you, North Korea. But later, when some conditional dependence is formed, I think we are going to have trade that is conditional. For instance, you need to back down on some of your missile development. You need to back down on some of your nukes development if you want more trade to happen and if you want the trade that has already happened to continue happening. I think both sides bring something for each other on the table. So why will North Korea accept this aid? Because I think the economic conditions in North Korea are bad. I think Kim Jong-un needs state machinery to run the state machinery, money to run the state machinery to make sure that the police and the army and everyone is being fed. Secondly, I think there's also a historical trend of it have North Korea and the leaders having the incentive to do so. For instance, during the 2001 famine, North Korea readily accepted help and aid and was ready to come to the table to talk about compromise. I think it has again post-COVID-19 accepted these things. For instance, like North Korea and South Korea together being in Olympics, North Korea being welcoming of the anti-leaflet law. I think incentive exists on both sides to come and negotiate and strike a compromise. I think we should embark on this incentive that exists and make sure there's more economic and political stability. So before I move on, so the end goal is to not be seen as an antagonistic to North Korea and to make sure that they're not seen as happy. So before I move on to my substantive case proper, I'll take a POI from closing. Opening. I'll just move on. So first of all, let me characterize you the economic position of South Korea. I think it's very well and can offer what China offers. For instance, it's as a globalized economy. I think it has semiconductors. It makes things that are often used as inputs and raw materials in the Chinese economy, and it has everything in its economy that China also has to offer. I think it's an equal footing to the Chinese economy. I think it's connected to other countries and can also provide trade routes to other countries and to the world in general. So first steps are why North Korea's reliance to foreign actors is reduced on our side of the house, and why is this something that is a good thing? So what's the problem? I think North Korea to run the state machinery needs money, it needs airplanes, it needs missiles, it needs the economy to function. So what does it do? I think it creates a dependence on China to run its state machinery. I think this Chinese dependence looks like, for instance, China continuously minimally supporting trade, for instance, its companies illegally sending money, even when it's illegal. I think this is something that China continuously does. I think how does this change on our side of the house? What is the mechanization? I think we bring trade to North Korea, and because North Korea already has an incentive, as we have proved to you, to in its interest to negotiate with South Korea, because South Korea's economy is equally, in fact, more competitive to have this economic cooperation that exists, that I've already proven to you. That means you're likely to come into the negotiation table, and you're likely to form economic interconnectedness, and hence your economies are going to, North Korea's economy is going to some extent depend on South Korea's economy. That means your whole economic structures, your state machinery are now interconnected, are now also dependent on South Korean machinery. So what's the comparative that happens on the other side of the house? On their side of the house, North Korea only needs to deal with Chinese incentives. Only China can sanction and make North Korea do what it wants. However, on our side of the house, now because there's also a South Korean dependence that exists, economic dependence that exists, that means it has to align interests on both China and South Korea, and it has listened to you. What's the impact of this? I think it sets up China's own interest, and China using North Korea as a way to get its own way. For instance, China is usually in the United Council be like, if South Korea accepts this trade deal with the US, we'll tell North Korea to go rogue. If you do not accept it, then we'll tell North Korea, then we'll punish North Korea for going rogue. I think this gives China immense power to cause political instability in the region and make South Korea do what it wants. I think secondly, why is this important? Because it also puts North Korea on the table, and also this interconnectedness, apart from like Chinese influence, means that North Korea is more likely to give up their nuclear weapons, or more likely to reduce its missiles in the long term, because it has an economic dependence on you. I'll give a last chance to closing for a POI. I guess I'll move on. Has an economic dependence on it. So lastly, why this means that why US intervention is something US will support this. I think US and South Korea are both attacking North Korea from a two-faceted perspective. For instance, the US is looking at it militaristically and from another sanction-wise perspective, whereas South Korea is battling it internally and geographically. I think these are not entirely antithetical that exist. I think secondly, I think this is unlikely to cause any rift in tensions, primarily because in the recent talks between Biden and Moon, I think Biden has been accepting of the increasing relations between South Korea and North Korea. And I think the change in US perspective means that Biden is more open to out-of-the-box solutions with the North Korea problem. For instance, if this means that North Korea is likely to give up its nuclear weapons and likely to compromise, that means US is likely to support this in general. Let me summarize. Again, I think South Korea has a very strong economy. I think North Korea and South Korea both have an incentive to trade, and this is both have an incentive to trade, and this has been shown. There's an historical trend in both countries wanting to trade and to compromise and come to the negotiation table. This is good for South Korea, because you're able to reduce missiles and less militaristic tensions. And secondly, I think you also reduce North Korea's dependence on foreign actors, and that is generally a good thing. Never been prouder to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister very much for that speech and call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me loud and clear? I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think the most important question to ask in this debate is what actually is South Korea's incentive in the region and in itself, right? We believe that it's not as simple as like maintaining economic and political stability and reduce Chinese influence in the region. We believe primary goals of any government at all, and in this case is South Korea, is represents its people's voice and people's incentive with that they share the sentiment of the people that they have towards North Korea as well. And we are going to prove to you that the current generation of South Koreans are growing distant from the idea of reunification and trying to like help out North Korea neighbors more, and they are more likely to view them as a threat. More on this in my argument, but this is to note that it's not as easy to prove that there's an incentive from South Korea to simply trade with North Korea just because of that, right? Now let's deal with one of the key points on their side of the house first, right? That North Korea is likely to accept the deal and adjust themselves and becoming less threatening in the region. Why that is probably not the case, right? They never extensively analyzed the incentive of the Kim Jong-un regime beyond just like, oh, they need money and machinery to operate and exert dominance in their country, right? Also, Kim Jong-un regimes also have the incentive to remain the image of political strongman, independent, and also not showing forms of like giving in to other nations, right? That has been consistently what he has put into his campaigns and propagandas to the people, right? To show that he's independence of other nations and not giving in to those external pressures, right? That is why the Kim Jong-un regime has consistently been developing the more nuclear weapons and missiles and testing them to show that kind of dominance, right? Therefore, we believe that if the trade is going to be likely, the trade deal from South Korea has to be very generous and very favorable for North Korea with not much strings attached, right? If that is the case, we believe it's very unlikely for South Korea to exert any kinds of influence through the interdependence, right? Because the moment you start to exert any forms of control or any forms of influence to reduce the power of Kim Jong-un, we believe North Korea has more reasons than ever to not put themselves in that kind of conditions, right? And they're not dumb, right? They're not going to fall into a trick of falling into economic interdependence and slowly are forced to change their policies, right? They probably have strategies to see that, oh, if they develop interdependence over South Korea and South Korea has the ability to exert long-term influence on its ability to exert dominance in the region, they probably wouldn't take those traits that far anyway. Therefore, the interdependence that government wants to claim is not as likely as to happen as they claim it to be, right? But now back to our case on why it's actually not an important issue for South Korea to do such thing, right? Now, this is where the characterization of South Korean people come in on our part, right? We believe that South Korea people, unlike previous generations, do not share the same sentiment of wanting to reunify or wanting to like help out the North Korean neighbors, right? Therefore, the form of generous trade the South government characterized to you will create a very negative sentiment to the citizens who look at North Korea as a distant, as a more distant neighbor or even a threat to their nations, right? Helping out the enemies of your nation is probably the last thing the government would want to do to represent the people's voice of the nation, right? Now, moreover, even though they said that the Biden administration might be okay with South Korea increasing the trade with North Korea if it helps curb the missile development or the aggression of North Korea, we believe they have not substantially proven the mechanism that actually prove that they can actually reduce those kinds of aggression if the interdependence doesn't happen in the first place, right? Especially in the beginning, if they appear to be very generous to North Korea, we believe that Biden administration is not going to like that if it in turns leads to the empowerment of North Korean in this like next 5 or 10 years, right? We don't think that and that is why it will also lead to like less favorable trades with other nations that are currently sanctioning North Korea, right? This includes the US and many other nations that South Korea will risk their trade partners or their trade relationships just to exert their influence into North Korea, right? Which we don't think is a worthwhile trade for the South Korean government at the moment, where they have to prioritize on themselves, prioritize on citizens' interests, and not just to like try to reduce the North Korean influence, which it would lead to like them having to give up a lot of trade power, right? Now, here's more reasons why they shouldn't trade with North Korea in this crucial time if they actually want to reduce the power of North Korea, right? At the moment, sure, like North Korea is in a crisis after the COVID-19, but it's not like the 2001 famine, where back then they did not have much firearms and machineries and nuclear weapons. Right now they have more of those, and they are less likely to give in to the trade that could lead to them losing influence in the region, right? But before that, POI from OG.
If these negotiations reduce North Korea's militaristic development, why will their trade partners not want this?
Because you have not proven substantially that it will be likely for North Korea to curb its behavior in the first place. And more likely, in the initial stage of these trade deals, it has to be very favorable, and it helps North Korea out, and it probably leads to them mechanizing more and developing more arms and weapons during that moment where you are still going through the generous trade deals before you can exert long-term interdependence influence that you claim will happen one day, right? Now, that thing is less likely to happen than in 2001, simply because now, like, the context of COVID is different in a sense that now North Korea has even more like negotiating power in terms of machineries and missiles than back in 2001. So in the recent years, they have shown to become even more independent in the region, and so they're less likely to open up to a more influential deals in the long term from South Korea. Ultimately, we believe that the priority of South Korean governments is to represent the citizens' voice who are growing distant from the relationship with North Korea, citizens' voice who view them as more as a threat, and any kind of favorable deal you give to them is more likely to disappoint and not represent the sentiment of the citizen. All these reasons oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for that wonderful speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Hear.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, just something about our policy, right? It's incredibly unclear what characterization of South Korea and South Korean interests is being defined by all, because we've already told you that the status quo that exists in our world, as well as our world, is that President Moon is highly likely to negotiate with North Korea, willing to meet them at summits, as is Kim Jong-un to come to the same summits to shake hands, whether that be the Olympics or other places, and policies that are currently in place today, such as the Moonshine Policy or such as the anti-leaflet law, that are made to essentially alleviate the tensions that already exist between these two countries. So OP has to decide whether they want to defend status quo or whether they want to defend even less economic cooperation, because otherwise they already lose this debate, right? Okay, I'm going to do a couple of rebuttals, but before I do those, I'm going to explain why our policy and our mechanization does not actually hinge upon the impacts that they say are what our case depends upon, right? Because the motion specifically reads, would aim to significantly increase. With this idea in mind, I think it's fair to say for the burden on government to be that, like, if you aim to do this, then it is likely to be in your interest and empower you militarily as well as economically, right? And therefore, it's about the idea that, like, the government doing this is likely to then improve the relations and improve how they the amount of threat level they feel, for instance. The third thing I want to rebut very quickly is this idea that you have to represent the people's interests, and people are likely to and you need to triangulate those interests best, right? So I think the problem is symmetric, right? Like on opposition also, it's very relatively difficult to triangulate the interests of an average South Korean person. And I think even if nobody is pushing for reunification, because that's simply not what the current South Korean administration is pushing for, or probably what the majority of the people are pushing for. But instead, they're likely to push for not having active military threats. And while that does happen on behalf of the people, I think it's fair to say that as elected by the people, whatever President Moon is doing currently is what stands, and people don't run themselves, right? Surely we need to consider the interests of the administration as the primary goal in this debate, right? Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is that like this idea that like that we never extensively analyze the incentive of Kim Jong-un's regime. Firstly, we need to think like mostly about South Korean regime. If the analysis that is true that like it's about South Korean people's interests and like what they want, I'm not sure why we care about like the interests of like the North Korean people, but or even the interests of Kim Jong-un. But if the idea is that they want like Kim Jong-un wants to remain the political strongman and the campaigns and propaganda exists around them, we should also recognize that apparently that like incentive doesn't come into play when they are literally a state run by Russia and run by China, when those are the sole providers financially of anything that happens in North Korea. So I'm unsure as to why the political strongman doesn't come into play in that interaction, but will come into play in this one, right? Especially when we've proven in various points in history when Kim Jong-un has been willing to come to the table. Then they say that like our analysis is dependent on like trade deals from South Korea being generous and being favorable without strings attached. Like we've even taken the even if layer and like said that perhaps this may be true, but under that, like that is something that the current moonshine policy does cater to, because it is essentially unconditional aid, which is the definition of like economic cooperation, which I don't know if OP is defending or not because their counterfactual is incredibly unclear. But like given that, I think it's fair to say that like what opposition has said is essentially a straw man of the argument that was being made, and like we're perfectly willing to offer good levels of economic cooperation. So that includes reducing tariffs, reducing embargoes, making sure that each country is able to export products that are in their comparative advantage and things like that. And we're perfectly willing to trade with the state machinery that exists in North Korea, right? And our main goal, of course, throughout all this has been to prove that it is within South Korean interests, right? So like that straw man aside, I want to quickly like refocus this debate into like what Chetu set up initially, right? Which is that like what we need to prove is that aiming to do this no longer juxtaposes these two countries and is able to reduce the tensions between South Korea and North Korea, right? And like and we believe that we've already fulfilled this burden as long as there is less military might in like the DPRK being spent on pointing missiles towards South Korea and making sure that you're making political threats. I think that's a goal that's already been achieved when Kim Jong-un can be an actor that is like while they may be a rational actor, they're willing to like make threats of violence and act upon them in most instances. So I think that like insofar as it is in the interest of the South Korean people to be militarily safe, we are the team that's proven to you how we fulfill that goal, right? I quickly want to talk about the idea that came at the very end of like the speech that was just before mine about the idea that like, oh, it's not like the 2001 famine where there's no nuclear weapons and then more likely to give it. While that may be true, I think like the comparative is fairly important, which is that like that North Korea is absolutely willing to like take South Korean aid instead of simply just taking Chinese aid, because they like naturally have like Kim Jong-un naturally has incentives to not depend on the interests of only one country, as they've already shown through various opportunities by like coming to summits and like by their whole family coming to summits. And like they have an incentive to create better ties with South Korea because they've publicly supported these negotiations, and also, of course, while it's already happened, North Korea generally has incentive to be geographically secure as well. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from OO or CO.
Can I? Okay, so the difference between aid from China and South Korea is China has the incentive to empower the regime to strengthen its military. South Korea's incentive to trade is to reduce the tension within the region. It's completely different thing, and that's why Kim Jong-un wouldn't take the latter.
Okay, that could potentially be true, but surely North Korea, like as we've already explained, North Korea's these two incentives are just like going to counter each other out, right? North Korea's incentive to not be over reliant on one country, but we think that incentive is probably stronger because like at this point North Korea is essentially at like the beck and call of a much bigger country, and and China is like likely to also exert like political power over North Korea, and we think that that is an incentive that is slowly going away as North Korea does make appearances at summits and things we've talked about. That's something we've seen no particular rebuttal to, especially, right? The last thing that I want to talk about is the comparative, right? Because the future without like such intervention at this point by South Korea is one where military tensions are likely to be far higher, right? Like DPRK is far much more likely to be antagonized when the state machinery is run by Russia and China, who have immense incentive to counteract like US globalization and generally US global power. And so when these two countries essentially become like actors that are highly dependent on their much bigger economic partners, that's far likely to be a worse world for South Korea and North Korea as they battle the like military and political posturing that these three countries want to do to each other. And I think that is a far bigger problem. So if South Korea is able to at least alleviate tensions within like its geographical proximity to North Korea, it's far more likely that like you don't essentially aggravate the situation to that point, and South Korea is able to, in a future where this happens, maintain some level of military sovereignty, maintain some level of like lower threat. And I think that is the proof that we've done in this debate to prove why this is in South Korea's best interest. Proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for those remarks and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out the top half. Hear, hear. DLO, do we have you?
Pardon? Can I have that again?
I can hear you now.
Okay. I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let me clear all stands a bit. We think that all the things that we have pressure, everything that we have that on North Korea shouldn't be undone, right? What we are proposing to you there is that on their side, they're going to empower Kim Jong-un even more. Firstly, which is something that South Korea do not want to. And secondly, it will deteriorate some kind of way, shape, or form the tide with US. Both of which go against the goal of South Korea, which is to ensure some form of change and minimize something that will happen in North Korea. And secondly, have good international relationship with the rest of the country. So I divide my speech into 2 parts. The first part is that on the point of tension and alleviating the influences. They tell you, firstly, that, well, China influence will decrease, right? Because North Korea do not want only to rely on one country. We accept that premise that North Korea do not want to rely on one country, right? What we think their analysis is lacking, that international relation talking, when you deal with countries, you kind of have priority, right? There's a hierarchy, right? It means that when you enter into the calculus of North Korea, there's no guarantee that they are gonna prioritize you as much as China, right? Why? We think that firstly, China has long relationship with North Korea in terms of trade, right? It means end of the day, with long history, they have built trust with China, right? It means that to a certain extent, North Korea has more incentive to trust China because of long history of trade. But secondly, right, comparing the power of economy that could have been, China is still the biggest economy, and that's more alluring for them to go for China. That means that even if in that basically you assert influence, right, we don't see the degree of the influence that they are proposing that undermines a lot of their benefit at the end of the day, right? But even worse, right, we think that even if you get to assert as much influence, it means that with the economic size power of China, it means that China will try to compete as much as you in order to outweigh South Korea, right? What does that mean? That means that China will have even more influence in North Korea, and it means that whatever policy you are pushing will be even harder to achieve. And if China really win in this hypothetical competition to outweigh South Korea, it means that South Korea will look even less important in the eyes of North Korea. Everything you propose will be harder to happen. So in comparative, like basically, let's recognize that North Korea now is authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Like it means that Kim Jong-un has every power to decide what will happen in North Korea and can control every aspect of the lives of citizens, right? And there has been no reform there. So basically on their side, when they begin to trade, right, what will happen is that all the money influx that go to North Korea will go to Kim Jong-un, right? And he has all the power to not use that money to the citizens, right? It means that even if their side try to claim it will help the better people, that's not going to happen. But secondly, and importantly, right, with more money, right, it means they have more money to invest into the missile stuff already, right? Because the recognize that missile takes capital to invest in it. By trading with them, you in some way you giving them more money to invest in that missile, and at the end of the day, it will make it empower that missile mission even more and become even more of a threat to South Korea. On comparative, right? We think that as long as South Korea want to ensure to avoid tension and missile crisis, right? We think that firstly, we stand out firm that we do not want to mess with you with all the human rights infringement and missile. We do not compromise, right? We send signal that there's no way we can be friends as long as you're doing that. But secondly, right, all the capital that they can use to import to the missile will have only one source, which is from China, right? It means that even if missile happen on both sides, on their side, with more trade, it comes more money and more money into missile. On our side, right? In our worst case, even if missiles has nothing to happen, we think that with the less money, the capacity of missile to destroy things will be a lot lesser, right? But further that, on the point of the regime, if to take it further and dealing with stuff, right? We think that COVID has a big impact enough that North Korea is changing the calculation in order for them to modernize the country in order to deal with post-COVID impact, right? The moment you begin trading with them, it means that they will have enough money to run the totalitarian and authoritarian regime they're going to, and the country, North Korea, can function as it, and there will be less likely to reform. On our side, right, we think that the tension of prolonged sanction and COVID combined together will put the pressure on them in some way, shape, or form, and that will change their calculus in order to perform trade, because apparently the trade with China is not enough for them of North Korea in order for them to grow. Before that, POI, yes.
Why does this matter insofar as we've already proved to you that aiming to cooperate already reduces your level of military threat?
That's why exactly, because once you cooperate with them, right, and they still have priority with China, it means that whatever you say is going likely to be outweighed by China, right? Because let's recognize, if you contradict China, which country they will choose? It's obviously China, because of firstly the economic power side, along history, right? You have to give alternative incentive why they will not choose China. You haven't done so. My next point is that what will the be intention with how will the tension in international realm, like because recognize that South Korean the function give them the image look in international platform to be human rights protector that do not want to prolong human rights infringement in North Korea in some way. We think that from the moment you begin trading with them, right, in the international platform, you will be perceived that you're empowering them by giving them more money and more money from trading, right? It means that in some way, shape, or form, not South Korea could likely be condemned for empowering North Korea, giving them more money to both make Kim Jong-un happy and to both put more money into missile, right? But even if take that best case that they say Joe Biden is different, like now he is out of the box to a certain extent, right? We mean that to a certain extent he wants to still protect human rights. But you're trading and symbolically upsetting that you bow to North Korea to a certain extent will lessen your negotiation power in international platform, right? As South Korea, which has so much potential, will not be willing to lose that. So in summary, I have proven to do that South Korea will not win against China and will only lose to US. And in order to secure everything we have done, must not increase the trade with North Korea. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech and call upon the Member of Government to open up the second half of the debate. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Give me a second. I think there's a big failure to understand coming from opening opposition as to why North Korea would not necessarily want to increase militarization and conflicts with South Korea. But I think this problem also ties back towards the explanation that was provided by opening government. What will I do as a member of government to you today? I'll do a few things. Number one, I'll firstly explain to you what the situation is in North Korea. Number two, I'll explain to you why is it more likely that North Korea would lessen the conflicts or the degree of hostility that exists with South Korea. And number three, I'll explain to you why it's in the best interest of not only the South Korean people, but also the South Korean government as a whole. But before I continue, a few forms of rebuttals I think need to be made towards the deputy leader of opposition. So one of the biggest claims coming from the deputy leader of opposition was to come to this floor and tell us why North Korea will more likely cooperate with China as opposed to South Korea. So we have to understand and recognize and look at the fact that the condition post-COVID is something that is not beneficial towards not only North Korea, but also China. China also is a country that is facing multiple sanctions from the Western world, and all these things are problematic not only towards China but also the North Korean government. North Korea recognizes that it's less likely that China will be capable of surviving the continued sanctions that are imposed towards not only them but also China. It is less likely that North Korea still would want to cooperate with China if they recognize that China is going to fail at one point in time. But also, the other thing that I think needs to properly be clarified is why the idea of when you pump more money into North Korea, it equates to more missiles. This is a very simplistic understanding towards this idea. You have to recognize business is something that's beneficial towards all sides at the end of the day, and war is something that disrupts business. I think this simple reason as to North Korea not wanting their trade and economic benefits coming from South Korea to be disrupted is more than enough of a reason for North Korea to want to lessen the harms or lessen the tensions that exist between them and the South. Now I'll move on towards explaining to you what the condition of North Korea is. The reason as to why there exist further tensions and the reason as to why there exists this great amount of conflict between the North and the South is simply because of the the isolationism that exists with North Korea. North Korea doesn't see a need for South Korea, or doesn't see a need for them to actually cooperate with any other country because of the policies that were brought up by the opposition bench. The problem that exists in status quo today is because of the continuation of the policies proposed by opposition house. The way in which we want to reduce conflict is by to firstly, number one, increase interdependency between these two states. So how will a closing government enter to this debate, and how will it be any different from opening government? So opening government explain to you a lot of things. They explain to you why it's necessarily now that there will be reduced tension between the North and South, but they never properly explain why North Korea would most likely not want to continue the tension. They explain the idea that, you know what, you're going to reduce the dependency towards China, but there's no proper explanation as to why South Korea would necessarily benefit from it at the end of the day. This debate is a debate in which what is the strategy that would work best for South Korea, and coming from closing government, we propose to you this strategy. We propose to you this strategy because it would best align with the interest of the South Korean people and also the South Korean government. But yeah, now I'll move on towards my argumentations. Number one, we have to recognize why North Korea would not want to increase its hostility. It's simply because of the amount of trade that could potentially benefit them. South Korea is an economic powerhouse that exists. It is an economy that can and will most likely be able to increase its potential in combating not only combating other states within the region, but it has the potential to increase the power that the economic power that it already has. China, on the other hand, even though it may have the ability to increase influence towards other surrounding regions, it's a nation that is facing further sanctions, and all these problems are not necessarily something that is beneficial in the eyes of North Korea. So what North Korea wants is, at the end of the day, something that benefits them economically. So if South Korea has the ability to fill in the gap that China leaves, there's little to no reason as to why North Korea wouldn't want to accept in the first place. This is something that was not recognized by both members of opening opposition. But before I continue, opening opposition.
I think China is now recovering from COVID and economically doing pretty well. Why still South Korea can outweigh China?
Yeah, because you have to recognize what is currently happening in China, because there is further tensions between the Chinese government and also the governments of most Western worlds and most of the world today, because a lot of people recognize how China is putting other countries into debt diplomacy and all these things. These are things that does not necessarily interest the North Korean government as a whole, not only the North Korean people. But yeah, so because at the end of the day, what South Korea actually wants is a reduced intention. It doesn't necessarily mean that South Korea would benefit entirely in terms of the economy, but if at any point in time there is a less likelihood that North Korea would bomb South Korea with nuclear missiles, I think it's more than enough of a reason as to why South Koreans would want this. But on this point, on why South Koreans as a people would also want this, we have to understand that the North and South are in no way, shape or form different from one another. They are ethnically the same. They are linguistically the same. They are still individuals who are family members who are stuck across the border. Even if the South Korean people wouldn't have that altruistic reason in the first place, we argue to you that not having nuclear bombs being shot at you is more than enough of a justification. But lastly, what necessarily happens when North Korea fails as a state or when it disintegrates as a state? What happens in the world of opposition? What happens now is when North Korea does eventually disintegrate because of the economic downfall that is currently happening towards them, it is more likely that China will have greater amounts of influence over North Korea. But not only that, it is more likely that North Korea would be absorbed into the Chinese sphere or the Sinosphere as a whole. This, as of itself, harms South Korea the biggest, because it's less likely that they have an ability to control North Korea, but it's also that they have a bigger communist power at their border. With that, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Member of Government for those remarks and call upon Member of Opposition to continue the case for opposition side. Hear, hear.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. So my speech will start in 3, 2, 1, now. So we believe that OG has a fundamental misunderstanding toward this motion because they fails to properly deal with the actor of this motion, which is South Korea. So as the government of South Korea, the government is first and foremost responsible for its own citizens. So the government really shouldn't put so much emphasis on the analysis of the incentive of North Korea about how they would like to have the incentive to cooperate, because it doesn't matter in this debate, because we're talking about South Korea, we're talking about what is good and beneficial to South Korea and to its citizens, right? So that even if the North Korea is willing to cooperate, it doesn't. So if in the very end it doesn't provide any benefits to the South Korea, we're still going to. So we're still not going to do this, right? So like, what is the lack from the our upper house analysis and also characterization of the situation of South Korea is that they fails to notice that South Korea is in history has been to a large extent heavily relied on Western countries' cooperation, especially America. What does this mean? So looking back in history, it is US that has exerted the most essential power over South Korea, and in almost every aspect of its societies, including the establishment of the political institution, the economic system, the education system, and so forth. So basically, you can see that the modern society of South Korea has been established by the US and also by the Western liberal democracies. So following these kind of like following the routine or these kind of norms of these kind of Western countries, the modern South Korea is established. So as a result, US has exerted the greatest power and greatest control over South Korea, and South Korea has developed a great dependency on the US. So economically speaking, US has been one of the most important and international partners of South Korea, and a large percentage of the exports and imports products happened with the US, right? And also politically speaking, South Korea has been strategically placed as a part of the Asian Pacific rebalancing strategy propounded by President Obama as a way to balance and to stop the development of the China, right? So politically speaking, South Korea has been bound on the side of the Western liberal democracies and has been bound on the side of the US. If we have to put it this way, right? So the South Korea has been on the same top with the US and has been on the same side with the Western countries, as opposed to China, Russia, and including North Korea. So economically speaking, South Korea, and also on another level, economically speaking, South Korea has been heavily reliant on US, and this situation is really hard to change, and any attempt to challenge this kind of power and this kind of influence of US with is very dangerous and also detrimentally affect the economy and also the social stability of South Korea. So by significantly increasing the economic cooperation with North Korea, places North Korea as one of the most important cooperation partners, even exceeding, for example, the status of China, Japan, and US and so forth. So this kind of action is very, from the US eyes, will be deemed as a very dangerous and also even some kind of a betrayal, right? So this kind of action would be deemed as a gesture to welcome republic countries, and at the same time betray the union and between the side of the Western liberal democracies. So the economic cooperation with North Korea will to a large extent provokes US and provokes other Western liberal democracy countries. And so what will happen with this kind of provocation happen? So the South Korea will to lose even more some cooperation with the partners of, for example, including the US and other Western liberal democracy, and they're going to lose lots of the trade and also the economic cooperation with Japan, US, and other Australia and so forth. So why this is extremely detrimental to the economy of the South Korea is that South Korea, as we have characterized before, has been largely relied on the US on the US, and so a large percentage of the economic products, the exports and imports has been bound with the US. So if we lose this kind of economic cooperation, it's going to be extremely detrimental and affect the social stability of the South Korea. And so cooperation with South Korea is deemed in a political level resulted in even more isolation and even sanction from the US and also other Western countries. So it's going to further weaken the South Korea's political power in the international businesses. Now that the South Korea loses the greatest support and the biggest ally, which is the US. So let's look back as what has been established by the OG. So OG to some extent has acknowledged the fact that the economic cooperation with the South Korea essentially isn't going to be that beneficial, right? So economically speaking, South Korea ought to gain much from this kind of economic cooperation. So because for example, the economic situation for the North Korea isn't that good. So also it doesn't have any advanced technology, right? So now that economic speaking, the South Korea is going to benefit from the kind of economic cooperation, and it's also going to further suffer from the loss of the cooperation with other kind of Western democracy countries, including US. So economic speaking is not going to benefit the citizens and benefit the well-being of the South Korea. So now let's look at the political safety. So let's give the OG basically argues that they are going to offer the North Korea a very generous offer, and in exchange for the peace, for the political safety, to reduce the risk of missiles and also some other weapons and so forth. So why this is not to happen and not to beneficial? Because firstly, the North Korea is not going to it's going to further rely on China. It's going to, in this kind of situation, it's going to be very hard to change by the simple power of the South Korea. So South Korea is to suffer even more just to bag for some kind of the fake safety and some other unreliable promises of the North Korea. And also this is going to further provoke the US, and also by provoking US, it's going to further be detrimental to the safety of the South Korea. Given the reasons above, proud to oppose.
Like to thank the member of opposition for that speech and call upon the government whip to close the case for the government bench. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, thank you. So starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think I can agree with side closing opposition on the idea that this motion is supposed to be prioritizing on the fact of South Korea citizens instead of the idea of North Korea and all these other countries. Nevertheless, these are still stakeholders that we need to discuss, and we cannot really forget these stakeholders because they're closely tied, they are closely related towards the motion for today, right? So before I move on towards what I would do in this debate, I'll just clarify what I would actually do in this in my speech, right? So firstly, I'll be giving few responses towards sides of opposition, opening and closing, starting with closing first. Secondly, I'll be clarifying again what side closing government has contributed towards this debate for today. And thirdly, I'll be explaining why we win this debate for today. So side closing opposition came up with this idea of how South Korea depends a lot on Western policies and how they are dependent on a lot on the United States economically, and because of that, they will be able they would need to follow the US standards on whether they should actually have these diplomatic relationships or economic cooperations with North Korea. So two levels of rebuttals towards that. We feel that firstly, you need to understand the idea that the United States priority has always been to reduce the influence of China, right? And as opposition has already clarified, the idea of China actually taking over North Korea will become even significantly larger if South Korea doesn't have this economic cooperation with North Korea, right? Because we need to understand the fact, no matter what happens inside opening government or inside government or opposition, China is always a superpower that needs to be taken care of, right? And China has already a power towards North Korea, right? So if South Korea doesn't intervene or doesn't have this relationship with North Korea to at least something that is way more unbeneficial towards opposition side, because China will become even more worse inside opposition. So that's one thing that side opposition fails to clarify, right? And one more thing also, you need to understand on the idea of how the United States as a whole wants to reduce the influence of China, right? So we feel that because the United States wants to reduce this influence of China, the United States, instead of economically sanctioning South Korea probably for entering into an agreement with North Korea, they will probably support South Korea because this is something that will put China under control, right? Or at least reduce the impacts of China, right? So we feel that it is completely untrue for side closing government, closing opposition to come up and say that just because South Korea is depending a lot on the United States and their policies, they would not be allowed to have into this economic cooperation with North Korea, right? So I feel that's something that is a misconception inside closing opposition, right? So moving on to side opening opposition, right? So the whole idea on side opening opposition is this idea that by South Korea actually giving economic advantages towards North Korea, they will be able to build up their power. And when they build up this military power that they have, they'll start invading this world, and they put it to a certain extreme extent where they will start bombing every nation, and they will start probably go on a massacre spree because of this military threat that they have, right? I feel like my first speaker has already explained, but I will explain even in a further more in even more detail, right? So one thing is you need to understand that economic advantage doesn't really mean that true to a certain extent, it increases the economic powers of a certain country, but it doesn't mean that a military power of a certain country will increase, right? And the assumptions that side opening opposition came up saying that these economic advantages will eventually be used by Kim Jong-un just for military and not prioritizing these economic advantages that they gain from South Korea towards their citizens is an assumption, right? First of all, they have failed to prove why Kim Jong-un would just spend all their money towards South Korea inside their military power, not giving their priority towards the citizens, right? Given the fact that they also have acknowledged the fact that North Korea as a whole is already having this financial crisis due to the pandemic, right? Due to the sanctions that they have, right? So we feel because of this itself, these economic advantages that they would gain from South Korea will eventually be given to the citizens itself, right? Because of this pandemic and the requirements that they need to solve the issues of their citizens, right? So whatever that they said on North Korea just putting entire budget of monies into their military power is a very vague assumption brought up by opposition and has not been clarified, and I don't think should stand, right? So that's the idea on opposition, right? So I feel that side opposition as a whole is something that doesn't really acknowledge the fact of how this would benefit South Korea as a whole, right? And they focus too much on whether North Korea will actually accept this economic cooperation and whether North Korea would actually benefit from this, right? So moving on towards what we have contributed towards side closing government. But before that, yes, UI from opening opposition.
North Korea is authoritarian, so if they want to pull econ budget into military budget, they can do so, and they have done so. Regard on this point.
Yes, we understand that, but you yourself have mentioned the idea that North Korea itself is in current state of pandemic where they have crises amongst the citizens. So what you have failed to prove to us that this budget they will gain economically will just be put into their military power and not be given towards the citizens when their citizens also need it as well. Because you need to understand, as cruel as how you think the North Korean dictator is, he cannot just let everybody in his country to die, right? Or he cannot just let everybody in his country to starve, right? So that's a misconception inside opening opposition, right? So moving on to what we have contributed towards this debate for today, right? We feel that we tell you two things, right? We tell you that first of all, this economic advantage that South Korea would probably gain from North Korea is just a side benefit that South Korea will gain when it comes towards the benefits of its society as a whole, right? What truly South Koreans will gain is this idea of reducing this tension between countries, right? Or at least reducing this military threat that North Korea that already has in this country, right? And also one more thing that we have told you how it will benefit South Korea as a whole is this idea that they will actually reduce this Chinese influence and this influence from China, right? That these North Koreans have, and this will eventually be in favor towards the Western countries as a whole, right? So that's three arguments that we think that side closing government has already explained to you. And we feel that the main crux of this idea is that we acknowledge the fact that North Korea can be a military threat. And that's exactly why we feel that this tension between countries should be reduced. And why is this in favor of these South Korean citizens in terms of economic cooperation? Because this economic cooperation will eventually lead towards this tension being reduced and military threats to be more or less unlikely in our side because of this economic cooperation. Because you also need to understand the fact that business and war is something that goes against each other. So when you are in business with a certain country, the likelihood of you entering into a war with a country is going to be significantly less, right? So why we think that we take over this debate today? We feel that we have clearly identified the idea of how this would eventually benefit the citizens of South Korea. We focus on North Korea as a whole, on how they would eventually accept this, but we feel that still the priority should be whether South Korea citizens would beneficially gain from this. And we feel that South Korea will beneficially gain this on three reasons. One, it will reduce this tension between these countries. Economically, also they would gain, and also they will reduce the influence of China, right? Which will eventually be in favor of Western citizens, of Western people. And because of all these reasons, proud to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for those remarks and call upon the opposition whip to close out the case for our bench and the debate as a whole.
Am I audible? Thank you. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. So first, I will make some responses to what Government Whip has just mentioned, and then about how actually my partners is the unique one in this debate to actually pushing forward the case for the opposition and actually beat upon OG's cases. So first, I think what Government Whip actually rebutted us is like the US have less incentives in terms of like reduce. So the main focus of the US is actually reducing China's power, and in the end, it's you on your side of the house that more of them may not paying that much attention in this kind of South Korea's choice. But we think there are four layers of responses here. First, we think the fact that actually not going to change on both sides of the house is that the China are actually hugely tightened with North Korea's relationship, and actually because of the power imbalance, China has a huge like influence on like how North Korea actually going to react or something like that. But actually, what our side has going to change is from the perspective, as my partner has already mentioned, from perspective of the South Korea, how actually it signifies its choosing of stances between like it's whether between China or between Korea. So the second layer is that what our side has actually changed is that the US intention for actually putting China under control through this kind of economic like cooperation between South Korea or North Korea is something that highly unlikable to being reached as just as the government side once proposed, because this is not some problem that's going to solve on your side of the house, and we did not see some kind of mechanism about how this kind of significantly increasing of this kind of cooperation will actually making US have a more say in terms of controlling the Asian area. And third, we think what's actually going to change in our side of the house is for how this kind of South Korea how this South Korea actually signify between the stances they're going to choose. So what US are more likely to react, and the impact that was going to shoulder upon is more likely to happen on the shoulder of the South Korea instead of some other thing. This is some more like more direct and actually a more tangible way for the US to choose to do so. And the second thing that CG was highlight and that the contribution is actually reducing the tension of between South Korea and North Korea. We think there's also three responses here. So first, because I think I've already heard from the characterization of Deputy Prime Minister that this kind of tension is already relatively lifted between South Korea and North Korea. So your kind of impact is actually not that important in terms of
by simply cooperating economically, how this kind of tension are actually being solved. And B, we think by lowering down China's kind of influence in this kind of thing, it's not a relatively good impact that your side of the house is more likely to achieve. And we think only the thing that only provided by CJ is actually like making the South Korea citizens to have like on the interest of South Korea citizens for them to have like more economic or like political benefit through your kind of proposing. But my partner has also uniquely explained to you why this kind of backlash that was, and that's kind of fears that was created from the West countries are actually more and more to be shouldered upon to the kind of to the South Korean citizens, and why, and it's in this kind of comparison on how actually we are making the lives of the South Korean citizens more. We think our side of the house actually wins this kind of debate. And moving on to how what OG actually provided us today. So let me focusing upon the comparison with deputy prime minister, which means that this kind of military tension is actually higher outside the house because of like the proxy war when the China and Russia are expanding the power or something like that. But first, we think PN's model of like significantly increasing this kind of economic mechanism has not sufficiently shown us how this kind of economic cooperation will actually going to shift it to the military field and actually being like practicalized by the North Korea government and simply by cooperating economically. And second, we think this kind of cooperation also cannot achieve the sovereignty and which was actually currently largely exists already in the North Korea government. And third, we think this kind of backlash is actually worse on your side of the house. Why is that so? Because we think, as my partner had already tell you, by showing this kind of in-Korean cooperation trend being bigger and bigger to this kind of Western countries, the Western country, especially for the US, are the ones who could use this kind of like highly contingent economy that was exist in South Korea. And we think this is a far worse choice for South Korea to do so. And so we think as CEO today, we're the ones that uniquely tell you this kind of signal effect that was politically shown, apart from some kind of actual tangible economic benefit that was gained from this kind of cooperation between South Korea and North Korea, is something that as South Korea should consider more. And in this kind of specific point, my partner is the one who uniquely told you how this kind of like proxy war or this kind of signal effect actually existed because of the historical or some kind of structural reasons that was in the South Korea government between the relationship of them and the Western countries. And second, we think this kind of comparison from like the North Korea choosing between like China and South Korea is also something that my partner already told you. It's not that likely to become the center of the debate, because the essential problem is that as we think at some point also implied in OJ's point is that North Korea is actually glad to increase one or two some kind of member countries for them to cooperate, because maybe they are in the need of having more chances to go economically sufficient. So the problem here is actually shifted towards whether or not it's a better choice for South Korea to take this kind of choice. And that's why we think as CEO's contribution is actually the more important and the focusing of this kind of thing. So I will take a point from OG. Oh, sorry, it's a protected time. So, okay. I'm really sorry. And then, so what has my partner uniquely told you today? So first, we think that this kind of compelling importance is that how this kind of mechanism are sufficient pushing forward opposition's case on whether or not it's in the interest of the South Korea government to choose this kind of thing. So what the mechanism we hear from OO is that it is better more in the consideration of the South Korean people or something that. But we think it's also like pointed out by DPM that the interest of the people, or like this kind of willingness from this South Korean people's mind is something that more likely to be symmetrical. So we think with the unique thing is that how the tangible or like practically how South Korea are actually going infected, especially from the prospect of political stances being shown. So we think we're the ones who like pushing forward in this debate, and very glad to oppose.
Excellent speaker for those remarks, and all speakers for what was an excellent debate. Invite you to if you want to leave the Zoom room now, the adjudicators will adjudicate. Please rejoin in 15 minutes. So that's, oh God, math, at 23 past the hour.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.